Dorian Vescari always won. Every hand, every room, every person who stood in his way. But the night he collected $5 million from the cruelest bet of his life, Hazel Monroe was standing behind a door, and she heard every word. The shy, overlooked bookkeeper he married as a joke didn't cry, didn't beg. She walked out of that penthouse with $5 million from his private vault and disappeared without a single goodbye. 3 years later, the most feared mafia boss in Boston is on his knees, and he still doesn't know who put him there. Hit like right now and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. Stay until the end. You won't see this twist coming. Ta-da! The night Dorian Vescari decided to ruin Hazel Monroe's life, it was raining so hard the gutters on Hanover Street were choking on it. He didn't think of it as ruining anything. That was the thing about Dorian. He categorized human beings the way other men categorize tools. Useful, not useful. In the way. He sat at the head of a poker table in the back room of Caruso's, a place that smelled like old wood and newer money, and he watched Marcus Holt slide a bourbon across the felt like a peace offering. Marcus Holt was the kind of rival who smiled too wide. He ran the Port Authority rackets out of Southie, had 3 legitimate restaurant fronts, and a talent for making men feel comfortable right before he gutted them financially. Dorian had never trusted him. Didn't trust anyone who laughed that easily. "You're distracted tonight," Marcus said. "I'm never distracted. You folded on a full house 20 minutes ago." Dorian picked up his glass and didn't answer. The room had 6 other men in it, 2 of his captains, Ren Alcott and Price Duval, and 4 of Marcus's people whose names Dorian hadn't bothered to learn. The chandelier above them was real crystal, which was the kind of thing Marcus liked people to notice. Outside, rain hammered the alley window. "I want to make a different kind of bet," Marcus said. He leaned back in his chair and crossed his ankles like a man who thought he was untouchable. "Not cards." "Then you're in the wrong room. Hear me out." Marcus reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a photograph. He set it face up on the felt between them. "You know who that is?" Dorian looked at it without picking it up. "A woman. Mid-20s, maybe early 30s. Unremarkable coat, sensible shoes. She was standing outside what looked like a parking garage, holding a manila folder to her chest with both arms the way people hold things when they're not sure they belong somewhere. Rounded face, dark circles under her eyes, the posture of someone who had spent years trying to take up as little space as possible. "No," Dorian said. "Hazel Monroe. She's the bookkeeper. Works for Callaway Freight on Atlantic Avenue. Has been there 7 years. Lives alone in Alston. Eats lunch by herself every day on a bench outside the building because apparently she can't find anyone to sit with her." Marcus paused for effect. "She's invisible. Nobody notices her. Nobody talks to her. She's just there." "Why are you showing me this?" Marcus smiled. "Because I want to bet you $5 million that you can't make her fall in love with you and get her to walk down the aisle. No coercion, no threats, no Vescari muscle. Pure courtship. You have to actually charm her. Flowers, dates, the whole performance. And she has to say yes of her own free will." The table went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when something shifts. Dorian looked at the photograph again. The woman in it wasn't looking at the camera. She was looking down at the pavement, and there was something in the angle of her shoulders, a tiredness that went beyond physical, that Dorian recognized without wanting to. $5 million, he said. $5 million. Cash settlement the night of the wedding. "And if she doesn't say yes, then I collect $5 million from you." Marcus spread his hands. "You're the most feared man in Boston, Dorian. Supposedly the most persuasive, supposedly irresistible when you want something. Prove it." Ren Alcott shifted in his chair to Dorian's left. It was barely a movement, a quarter-inch adjustment, but Dorian caught it. Ren thought this was beneath him, which was exactly why Dorian picked up the photograph, studied it for 3 full seconds, and set it back down. "Deal," he said. He didn't look at Hazel Monroe's face when he said it. He was looking at Marcus Holt's eyes, checking for the tell he knew was there, the micro flicker of surprise that meant Marcus hadn't expected him to agree. He found it, which meant Marcus thought he couldn't do it, which meant Dorian was already going to win. He folded the photograph and put it in his pocket. What he did not do, what it would not have occurred to him to do, because Dorian Vescari had not considered the interior life of another human being in longer than he could remember, was think about what this would feel like for the woman in the photograph. He found her on a Tuesday. He'd had Price pull a full background on Hazel Monroe before the weekend was out. 31 years old. Born in Lowell, raised by an aunt after her parents died in a car accident when she was 9. Accounting degree from UMass Boston, night school, took her 4 years longer than it should have because she'd worked full-time to pay for it. 7 years at Callaway Freight, same desk, never promoted despite consistent performance reviews that said things like reliable and detail-oriented and works well independently, which was corporate language for nobody bothers with her. Annual salary, $42,000. Savings account, $11,000, which told Dorian she was careful. No credit card debt, no car payment, library card, a gym membership she'd apparently stopped using 8 months ago. She was not an interesting person on paper. He went to Callaway Freight at noon on a Tuesday and sat in a rental car, not one of his, across from the parking garage where the photograph had been taken. At 12:14, she came out through the side exit with a brown bag lunch and a paperback book and sat on the bench 20 feet from where Dorian was parked. He watched her for 20 minutes without approaching. She unwrapped a sandwich with the precision of someone who had packed it herself and knew exactly what was in it. She read her book with her thumb pressed flat against the page margin, the way readers do when they're worried about losing their place. She ate slowly. She looked up twice, once when a cab honked, once when a pigeon landed near her foot, and each time her expression was the same, a low-grade alertness that suggested she was braced, always, for something to go wrong. She was not happy. Not unhappy either. She was the particular kind of neutral that comes from spending years not expecting much. Dorian got out of the car. He didn't have a plan beyond making contact, which was unusual for him. He was a man who walked into rooms with every variable pre-calculated, but he had decided, watching her, that over-preparation would show. She was a bookkeeper. She would recognize a performance if it was too polished. He bought a coffee from the cart on the corner, crossed the street, and sat on the far end of her bench. She moved 2 inches to her left without looking up, making room. An automatic, deferential gesture that probably wasn't even conscious. He said nothing for 90 seconds, just drank his coffee. Then, "What are you reading?" She looked up. Her eyes were brown, the ordinary kind, except that up close there was something watchful in them that the photograph hadn't captured. She showed him the cover, a mystery novel, mid-series, with a creased spine that indicated she'd read it before. "Any good?" "Yes," she said, and went back to it. He almost smiled. Most people, when Dorian spoke to them, didn't go back to what they were doing. They pivoted toward him. She had pivoted away. "I've been coming to this block for a meeting," he said. "3rd week in a row. You're always on this bench." "I eat lunch here," she said, still reading. "Every day." "Do you always read the same book?" She looked up again, slower this time. Her expression was the controlled kind, the face of someone who had learned that showing annoyance had consequences. "This is my 4th time reading it," she said carefully. "The first read is for the story. The second is to see the clues you missed. After that, you're just reading it for comfort." Dorian said, "What's comfortable about it?" And that specific question, asked without a trace of condescension, made her pause. "The detective always figures it out," she said, after a moment. "No matter what. She always gets there in the end." He nodded like that was a reasonable answer, not like he was processing it, not like he filed it away. Just nodded. "I'm Dorian," he said. She hesitated the way people hesitate when they're not sure an interaction is going to cost them something. "Hazel," she said. He finished his coffee, stood up. "I'll probably be back Thursday. That meeting runs every week." He walked away without looking back, and he did not let himself think about the fact that what she had said about the detective, "she always gets there in the end," had landed somewhere in his chest in a way he had not expected and did not want. He came back Thursday, and the Thursday after that. By the 4th week, she was turning slightly toward him when he sat down, which was not much, but was measurable. He brought coffee for her the 3rd time, black with 1 sugar, because Price's research had noted she took it that way from the cart on the corner, and she looked at the cup for a moment before accepting it with a thanks that was short but genuine. He asked about the books. She'd moved on to a different one. Same author, earlier in the series. He listened. He didn't offer opinions about books he hadn't read. He asked questions instead, specific ones, and she answered them with increasing willingness, the way water moves faster once the channel is clear. He learned things that weren't in Price's file. She had wanted to be an architect when she was young. She'd given it up because the math was different from accounting math, spatial, intuitive, and she hadn't trusted herself to learn a new kind of thinking when she was already stretched thin. She regretted it, not loudly. The way people regret things they've made their peace with, but not quite. She'd had one relationship 3 years ago. It had lasted 8 months and ended when the man told her he was moving to Seattle and didn't invite her to come. She'd found out from a mutual acquaintance that he was already seeing someone there before he left Boston. She talked about it flatly, with no visible wound, which told Dorian the wound was deep enough that she'd learned to work around it. He did not tell her anything real about himself. He told her he worked in logistics, not a lie exactly, just the thinnest possible slice of truth. He told her he grew up in the North End, which was true. He told her his mother had died when he was 12, which was also true, and which he had not told anyone in years, not because it was a tactic, but because it came out before he decided to say it, and he didn't take it back. She looked at him differently after that, a fraction of a degree of warmth that she hadn't extended before. He told himself it didn't matter. It was useful. That was all. The first dinner was her idea, which was what he had been waiting for. She mentioned offhandedly that she'd been trying to find a good Ethiopian restaurant in the neighborhood and hadn't had anyone to go with. He said he knew one on Columbus Avenue if she wanted company. She said she'd think about it. 2 days later, she texted the number he'd given her and said yes. He wore a jacket without a tie. He arrived 3 minutes after she did and apologized, and she waved it off and said she was always early, so it probably wasn't his fault. And that small self-deprecating honesty made something tighten in his jaw that he ignored. The restaurant was dark and warm and smelled of cardamom and grilled meat. They ate with their hands from shared injera bread, which required a loosening of formality that Dorian had calculated would help. She loosened. She talked more than she had on the bench. She told him about a mistake she'd found in Calloway's accounts 3 months ago. Not her error, someone else's. A transposition that had buried $40,000 in the wrong column for 6 years, and how she'd spent 2 weeks tracking it before reporting it, and her supervisor had thanked her and moved on without mentioning it to anyone above him. "You didn't push for credit?" Dorian asked. "What would that have gotten me?" "Recognition, a promotion. Something." "I've been there 7 years," she said simply. "I know what pushing gets me there." He heard what she wasn't saying. He'd been hearing it for weeks. The story of a woman who had learned that effort, in her specific context, was not rewarded, and had quietly adjusted her expectations to match. Not broken, not defeated, just recalibrated. He found it, to his own irritation, infuriating on her behalf. He ordered dessert she hadn't asked for, and slid it to her side of the table when it arrived. And she laughed, a short surprise sound, genuinely unguarded, and said, "You're strange." And he said, "Yeah," and meant it more than she knew. He walked her to the tea stop. He didn't touch her. He said goodnight and watched her go down the steps and told himself, this is going well. This is on schedule. This is a $5 million investment behaving correctly. He drove home through the wet streets of the North End and sat in his car in the private garage beneath his building for 7 minutes before going upstairs. And he didn't think about anything in particular, which was its own kind of answer. What? The months that followed had a rhythm to them that Dorian had not anticipated. He had expected the project to feel like work, the kind of calculated, exhausting work that running an organization required, the constant management of variables, the suppression of every genuine impulse in favor of the strategic one. He had run long plays before, slow burns. He knew how to be patient when patience was the weapon, but patience wasn't quite the right word for what he was doing with Hazel Monroe. They went to the Ethiopian restaurant twice more. They went to a farmer's market in Jamaica Plain on a Saturday morning because she mentioned it and he had nothing to counter with. He stood in the cold with a cup of terrible coffee and watched her weigh the difference between 2 types of apples with the same focus she brought to her accounting columns. And he did not feel like he was performing patience. He felt, disturbingly, like he was somewhere he didn't mind being. He brought her books. Not ones he'd researched, ones he picked, cold, from the mystery section of a used bookstore on Newbury Street, based on nothing but instinct and the things she'd told him about what made a good detective novel. She texted him about them afterward. Long texts, for her, which meant 4 or 5 sentences, which she broke into 3 separate messages sent over 15 minutes, and which told him she had written and rewritten them before sending. He texted back. He was good at it in a way that surprised him, precise, without being formal. She responded to precision. She was a woman who distrusted warmth that came too fast, which meant he gave it to her in degrees, and each degree she received like something she was not sure she deserved. He hated that, the not sure she deserved it. It made something in him go tight and ugly. He took her to a concert in October, a string quartet at a small venue in the South End, not his taste, but hers in a way she hadn't explicitly said, just implied through a comment about a piece of music she'd heard on the radio. She wore a green dress. He noticed, registered it, filed it away somewhere that was not the strategic part of his brain, and did not examine it further. Afterward, she was quiet, in the way that meant she was moved rather than bored, and he walked next to her through the cold street and said nothing because he understood, from watching her for 6 months, that she did not need to fill silence, and neither did he. And that understanding, that specific compatibility, landed on him like a slow weight. Marcus Holt called him in November. "How's the project?" Marcus said. The smile was audible. "On track," Dorian said. "She bought it yet?" Dorian looked out his office window at the harbor. The water was black and cold. "She will." "You're sure? Because some of my people who've seen her say she's not exactly—" "Don't," Dorian said, and his voice went to the register that ended conversations, and Marcus went quiet for a beat before laughing it off. After he hung up, Dorian sat with the phone in his hand for longer than he needed to. He told himself the don't had been tactical. She was his investment. Marcus didn't get to weigh in. He told himself that until it started to sound almost true. He proposed in January on a Wednesday, which was not a romantic day, and he chose it for exactly that reason. She would not have believed a grand gesture. He knew her well enough by then, knew that performance would have triggered the careful watchfulness she deployed against things that seemed too good, which was most things. So he did it on a Wednesday evening at the Ethiopian restaurant, the first one, because it was theirs in a way that didn't require explanation. And he ordered the wine without asking because he knew what she would want. And when it arrived, he reached into his jacket and set a ring on the table between their plates. She went still. The ring was simple. He had spent 40 minutes in the jewelry store ignoring the salesperson and picking it himself. White gold band, a single oval sapphire, nothing that screamed wealth, because she would have recoiled from wealth. It looked like something chosen by a man who understood her rather than a man who had money to spend. "Hazel," he said. She looked at the ring, then at him. Her face had gone through 4 expressions in the span of 3 seconds, and the final one, the one that settled, was fear. Not of him, of wanting it. "This is real?" she said. "Yes." "Because—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "People don't—" She stopped again. She was not a woman who cried in front of others. He could see her not crying. "I'm not the kind of person this happens to." "It's happening," he said. "Dorian," her voice was careful, cracking at the edge. "I need you to know that I'm not. I know I'm not." "I know what you are," he said. And because he was Dorian Viscari, because he had spent 8 months absorbing every specific detail of this woman, he said the true things. The detective books, and the architect she could have been, and the apples at the farmer's market, and the way she reread things for comfort, and the $40,000 she found in a column and never got credit for. He said, "You are the most precise person I have ever met." He said, "You don't waste anything, not words, not attention, not feeling." He said, "I want to marry you." He said all of it, and none of it was a lie, which was the thing he did not let himself examine. She looked at the ring for a long time. She said, "Yes." The wedding was small, at Dorian's insistence, which she accepted gratefully because she had almost no one to invite, and took place in a private event room at a hotel in Back Bay, on a Saturday in March that was gray and cold and suited them both. She wore ivory, not white, and she had done her own hair because she'd told him once that having people touch her hair made her anxious, and he had remembered and not pushed her toward a salon. The ivory suited her. She was not a conventionally beautiful woman, and she did not look like a woman trying to be one, and there was something about that, the refusal to perform a beauty she didn't think she had, that made her, to Dorian's eye, more striking than if she had. He stood at the front of the room and watched her walk toward him, and his chest did a specific, unwelcome thing that he identified and suppressed in the same motion. Ren Alcott was his witness. Ren's face, throughout the ceremony, was carefully neutral, which meant Ren was troubled, which meant Ren was smarter than Dorian gave him credit for, which was something to think about later, they said the words. She put the ring on his finger with steady hands, and he thought, she is not shaking because she is not afraid. She is not afraid because she trusts me. The knowledge of what he was doing to that trust moved through him like a cold current, and he stood in it without flinching because he had stood in worse. The officiant said, "You may kiss your bride." He kissed her. He had kissed women as a tactic before. He had kissed women as a reward, and as a weapon, and as a dismissal. This was none of those things, and he knew it immediately, and he stepped back and looked at her face, flushed, surprised, softer than he had ever seen it, and said quietly, "Hey." "Hey," she said back, and smiled. The unguarded one, the one she had no armor around. He thought, Marcus Holt is getting his money tonight. He thought, I won. He did not think, what have I done? The penthouse on Com Ave was his primary residence, not the safe house, not the office, not any of the 3 other properties he maintained for operational reasons. He had brought her here because bringing her anywhere else would have required explanations she didn't have the context for yet. He told her the penthouse was a family inheritance, which was technically true in the way that things acquired through violence over generations can be said to belong to families. She moved through this space the way she moved through everything new, slow, measured, touching nothing without permission, reading the room before committing to it. She stopped at the floor-to-ceiling window that looked out over the city lights and the Charles River beyond them and stood there for a long time. He poured whiskey at the bar, his wedding gift to himself. His phone buzzed. Marcus Holt. Confirmed with the witnesses. Congratulations, Viscari. Send the account details and I'll have the transfer done tonight. He typed back a routing number, pocketed the phone. Hazel was still at the window. He crossed the room and stood beside her, not quite touching, and looked out at the same view. Below them, Boston moved in its Saturday night way, cabs and bar crowds, and the slow red pulse of traffic lights. It doesn't look real from up here, she said. Most things don't. She turned to look at him. There was something in her expression, tentative and bare and genuine, that he recognized as the precise face of someone who had decided to be brave about wanting something. She said, I need to get something for my bag. I left it in the foyer. I'll get it. No, it's okay. She squeezed his hand once, briefly, and crossed the room. He stood at the window and looked at the city and heard, very clearly in the quiet of the penthouse, the particular acoustic quality of the foyer, the marble floors that carried sound the way stone carries sound, and heard his phone buzz again, and heard just as clearly the sound of Hazel Monroe's footsteps stop. He turned. She was standing in the hallway entrance. Not at the foyer. She had not gotten to the foyer. She had stopped at the hallway, which was where the library was, and the library door was open because he had been working in there that afternoon and had not closed it, and through the open library door, on the desk in plain view, was his laptop, open to the message thread with Marcus Holt. The routing number. Confirmed with the witnesses. Congratulations, Viscari. She was standing very still. He watched her read it. He watched the sequence of it. The moment of confusion, the rereading, the confusion becoming something else entirely. He watched her face go through the same 4-expression sequence it had gone through at the restaurant in January, except this time the one that settled was not fear. It was recognition. She stood there with her hand on the doorframe and she was absolutely silent, and the city hummed 30 floors below them, and Dorian Viscari, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, could not calculate what to say. She looked up from the screen. She looked at him across the length of the penthouse. And what he saw in her face was not what he expected. Not tears, not a collapse, not the crumbling of the careful, quiet woman he had spent 8 months learning. What he saw was a woman going very, very still inside herself. The way things go still before they move fast. Hazel, she turned and walked toward the foyer. Her steps were even, her back was straight. She picked up her bag from the entry table and she did not look at him again. "Don't," he said. She stopped, her hand on the door. "Hazel, it's more complicated than—" "How much?" she said. Her voice was quiet, perfectly controlled. "What?" "The bet." She still hadn't turned around. "How much was it worth?" He said nothing. "Dorian." She said his name like a period at the end of a sentence that had already ended. "How much?" "5 million," he said. She was quiet for a very long moment. Then she opened the door and walked out, and he heard the elevator call chime, and then silence, and he stood in the middle of his penthouse with the city lights behind him and let the silence be what it was. He did not go after her. He would send Ren in the morning. He would find her. It had been a business arrangement, and it was, in the coldest sense, complete. The money had transferred. The bet was won. He poured another whiskey. He stood at the window. He thought about the farmer's market, and the apples, and the green dress, and the way she'd said the detective always gets there in the end, with something in her voice that was the closest she'd ever come to hope. He finished the whiskey. At 3:14 in the morning, his phone rang. It was the man he kept on rotation to monitor his emergency vault, the physical one, in the sub-basement of the building on Commercial Street, the one nobody knew about except Dorian, Ren, and the monitor himself. The monitor said, "Boss, the vault's been accessed." Dorian went still. "What?" "About 40 minutes ago, someone used the secondary code, the physical key, and the secondary code. The alarm didn't trip because the code was correct. I only know because I'm on the overnight physical check." "How much?" Dorian said. A pause. The monitor's voice was the careful voice of a man delivering information he doesn't want to deliver. 5 million, sir. Even." The line went silent. Dorian stood in his penthouse kitchen with his empty glass and the city behind him, and the specific vertiginous feeling of a man who has just realized that the move he didn't see coming was already 3 steps ahead of the one he thought he'd won. She'd had the secondary code. She'd had the secondary code because 3 weeks ago he'd left the vault documentation on his desk, and she had been in his home office waiting for him to finish a call, and she was a bookkeeper who read numbers the way other people read faces, automatically, completely, without effort. And he had walked back into the room and found her looking at the window, patient and quiet. And he had not thought anything of it because Hazel Monroe was a woman nobody thought anything of. $5 million. Exactly. The amount of the bet. He set the glass down. Somewhere in this city, or beyond it, already, moving in the particular direction of a woman who had decided to start moving. Hazel Monroe had just become someone else entirely. And Dorian Vescari, the most feared man in Boston, who categorized human beings the way other men categorize tools, stood in his kitchen at 3:14 in the morning and understood for the first time that he had made a catastrophic miscalculation. Not the bet, not the marriage, the woman. He had never, not once in 8 months, thought to ask what Hazel Monroe would do if she stopped being quiet. Ren Alcott showed up at the penthouse at 7 in the morning with 2 coffees and the particular expression of a man who had been awake longer than he was admitting. Dorian was already dressed. He hadn't slept. He was sitting at the kitchen island with the vault monitor's report in front of him. A single printed page, itemized, $5 million, withdrawn in clean sequential pulls across 6 different internal accounts. All of it moving in the 40-minute window between when Hazel walked out of the penthouse and when the monitor ran his physical check. The transfers were clean, no flags, no hesitation. She had moved through his financial infrastructure like someone who had spent months memorizing the layout and then waited for the right moment to walk it in the dark, which was exactly what she had done. Ren set one of the coffees in front of Dorian and kept the other and didn't say anything yet, because Ren Alcott had been with Dorian for 11 years and knew the specific quality of silence that meant, wait. Dorian looked at the report. "She's gone," he said. "I know." Her apartment in Alston was cleared out. Ren nodded slowly. "Not last night. The landlord says she gave notice 3 weeks ago. Movers came on Thursday. 3 weeks ago. Dorian turned that over. 3 weeks ago, he had been finalizing the wedding arrangements. 3 weeks ago, Hazel had been texting him about the ivory dress she'd found, whether it was too formal, whether he thought ivory was pretentious. He had texted back, "It'll suit you." She had sent back a single period, which was her version of warmth. 3 weeks ago, she had already been planning to leave, which meant she had known, or suspected, or something in the 8 months of careful, calibrated courtship had registered as wrong in a way she hadn't shown him, hadn't let surface, had simply filed away, like a column that didn't balance, like a number that kept coming back $40,000 short. She accessed the vault with the secondary code, Dorian said. I heard. That code was never written down anywhere she could have found it. Then she memorized it. Dorian said nothing. Boss, Ren's voice was measured. I need to ask you something, and I need you to actually answer it. Ask. Did you give her anything? Access, documents, anything? Even by accident? The vault documentation was on my desk about 3 weeks ago. She was in the office. I was on a call. Ren was quiet for a moment. Okay. She looked at the window when I came back in. Yeah. Ren drank his coffee. She looked at the window. The two of them sat with that for a beat. Find her, Dorian said. I've got Price on it. Tell Price to move faster. Price is already moving as fast as Price moves. Ren set his cup down. Dorian, I need to say something else. Then say it. I told you not to take that bet. The room went very quiet. Not the silence of absence, the silence of a pressure system. Dorian looked at him. Ren didn't look away. 11 years and he still didn't look away, which was one of the 3 reasons Dorian had kept him this long. I told you in the car, after Caruso's. I said it was beneath the organization. I said Marcus Holt was baiting you. I said, I remember what you said. Then you remember I was right. You were right about Holt baiting me, Dorian said. That doesn't mean I shouldn't have taken it. You married a civilian. I'm aware. You brought her into this building, into the vault documentation radius, into your... Ren stopped himself, recalibrated. She's not just a civilian who got hurt and walked away angry, Dorian. She took $5 million. She knew the secondary code. She cleared her apartment 3 weeks before the wedding. This wasn't a reaction. This was a plan. Dorian looked at the report again. I know, he said. That means she's a problem. I know that too, which means she needs to be found for reasons that have nothing to do with... Ren paused again, and the pause had weight in it, the weight of something he was choosing not to say out loud. For reasons that have nothing to do with what? Dorian said flatly. Ren picked up his coffee. Nothing. Find her. Understood. Yeah. Price Duvall's report came back in 48 hours, which was fast for Price, and meant Price knew the situation was critical. Hazel Monroe had taken a cash purchase of a bus ticket to Albany on the night of the wedding. From Albany, there was no trace. No credit cards, no phone activity, no ATM withdrawals. The cell number she'd used for the past 8 months had sent one final text at 4:07 a.m. the morning after the wedding to a number Price traced to a prepaid phone already deactivated. The text said, I'm clear, don't worry. Someone had been waiting for that text, someone who already knew she was leaving. She had help, Price said. He was standing in Dorian's office, holding his tablet. With the particular posture of a man delivering a report, he'd checked 3 times because he didn't believe it the first 2. The Albany bus is the last hard trace. After that, she goes dark. Not amateur dark, professional dark. No metadata, no ping trail, nothing. Whoever she's with knows how to move people without leaving tracks. Military? Dorian said. Possible, or someone trained by military. The phone hygiene is too clean for private sector. Dorian thought about Price's file on Hazel Monroe, the file he'd read 8 months ago and considered complete. He pulled it up on his own screen and scrolled to the family section. Parents deceased, raised by aunt deceased 5 years ago. No siblings. No close friends in Boston. Price had noted the social isolation as a feature, which Dorian now understood was an idiot's reading of a woman who was not isolated by circumstance but by strategy. He scrolled further. The file was thin on extended family. One notation at the bottom. Maternal uncle, Garth Monroe. Address unknown. Former military, USMC, 20 years. Retired rank. Master Sergeant. Specialty, reconnaissance and field intelligence. Dorian stared at that line for 4 seconds. Price, he said. Boss. The uncle, Garth Monroe, former Marine reconnaissance. Price looked at his tablet, then up at Dorian, then back at his tablet. He's not in the file as a significant contact. No, Dorian said. He's not. Another silence. Find the uncle, Dorian said. Abend. Marcus Holt called on the 3rd day. Dorian let it ring twice before picking up, which was the exact number of rings required to signal that he was not available the moment Marcus wanted him, but was still willing to speak, which maintained the hierarchy. I heard there was some excitement on your wedding night, Marcus said. The smile again, wider this time. No excitement, Dorian said. A minor administrative issue. $5 million is a minor administrative issue. Where did you hear that number? A pause. I hear things, Dorian said. Who told you? Dorian? Relax. The point is, the bet settled. Money transferred. We're square. We're square, Dorian said. The girl's gone. That's unfortunate, I suppose. But the wedding happened. Witnesses. I'm an honorable man. I'm not going to try to claw it back just because she... Marcus, Dorian said, if I find out you had contact with her, any contact, before, during, or after, you're going to want to have already moved your family out of the city. The smile dropped out of Marcus's voice. What are you implying? I'm not implying anything. I'm telling you what will happen. He hung up. He sat in his chair for a moment, then called Wren. Put someone on hold, he said. I want his phone contacts from the last 6 months. Every call, every text. You think he's connected to her? I think the bet was designed to humiliate me. I think he expected me to fail, not succeed. And I think when I succeeded, something changed in his calculation. Dorian looked out the window. She had a plan. That plan required information about my organization that she didn't have when I first approached her. She spent 8 months in close proximity to me, but the plan was already forming before the vault documentation. Wren was quiet. Someone told her something, Dorian said, before I ever sat down on that bench. It was Wren who found the first thread, 6 weeks later, and he found it not through surveillance or phone records, but through a discrepancy in the books. Callaway Freight's accounts, the ones Hazel had maintained for 7 years, had been quietly, methodically restructured in the 14 months before she left. Not fraudulently, not in any way that would trigger an audit. But the architecture of the accounts had been reorganized, categorized differently, cross-referenced in a new pattern that Price, who was good with numbers but not a bookkeeper, had flagged as strange but not illegal. It was Dorian himself who understood what she'd done when he looked at it. She had spent 14 months mapping Callaway's financial structure, which intersected through 3 layers of shell companies with 2 of Dorian's laundering operations. Not because Callaway was dirty, because Dorian's money ran through Callaway the way bad water runs through clean pipe, and she had found it, traced it back, and quietly documented every connection without ever signaling she'd seen it, 14 months before Dorian ever sat down on that bench. He stared at the account architecture on his screen for a long time. She had not been a target. She had been a researcher. Whatever had led Marcus Holt to suggest her as the subject of the bet, whatever had put her name in his mouth that night at Caruso's, Hazel Monroe had already been watching Dorian Viscari's operation from the inside of a company he used as a vehicle. She knew who I was, Dorian said. Wren was standing by the window. Before you approached her? Yes. So the bench, the coffee, all of it. Dorian said nothing for a moment. Outside, the harbor was gray and flat. I don't know, he said. I don't know which part was real and which part was the counterplay. It was the first time in 11 years that Wren Alcott had heard Dorian Viscari use the word I don't know about a person, and it registered on Wren's face as something close to alarm before he smoothed it away. I need to find her, Dorian said, not for the money. Then why? Dorian turned from the window. Because I need to understand which moves were hers. The organization did not stand still while Dorian looked for Hazel Monroe. It contracted the way organizations contract when the man at the top is distracted. Small things, at first. A shipment delayed at the Charlestown dock that should have been pre-cleared, a payment to a port inspector that came 3 days late, a scheduling conflict between two captains that under normal circumstances would have been resolved in a single phone call. Dorian caught each one and corrected it, but the corrections cost time, and time was the thing he had less of as the weeks piled up. His captains noticed. Not all of them said anything. Danny Reeves, who ran the waterfront operations, came to the office in the 4th week and sat across from Dorian with his hat in his hands and said, carefully, that some of the men were asking questions. About what? Dorian said. About stability. About whether the thing with... Danny stopped. About whether there are going to be changes. No changes, Dorian said. Okay. Danny put his hat back on. Only thing is, Dorian, the Szymanski crew from Providence has been putting out feelers. Quiet ones. My guys on the dock say there's been conversations. About what specifically? About whether some of the port routes are available. Dorian was quiet. I told my guys it was nothing, Danny said. I told them the routes aren't available and anyone who said otherwise was wrong, but I thought you should know someone is asking. Who from the Szymanski crew? Petrov, their logistics man. Petrov was not a man who made independent moves. He moved when someone above him moved, which meant the Szymanski family had assessed something in the current situation and had decided the assessment warranted a quiet conversation about availability. Thank you, Danny, Dorian said. Close the door on your way out. He called Wren before Danny had reached the elevator. Szymanski is sniffing the dock routes, Dorian said. Wren took a breath. Okay. Okay is not an answer. Okay, we have a problem, Wren said. Is that better? How long before it becomes a hard problem? If they're at the feeler stage, we have maybe 8 to 12 weeks before they move from feeler to offer. If they make the offer to one of our dock captains directly, it depends on the captain. Danny Reeves won't flip. Danny Reeves won't. I'm less certain about Coyle. Dorian filed that. Keep Coyle off the primary manifest for the next month. Give him the secondary routing work. He'll know what that means. Then he'll have to decide what it means for him. Wren was quiet for a beat. Then, Dorian, Price found something on the uncle. Dorian went still. Garth Monroe. He owns 40 acres in the Flathead Valley in Montana. Bought it 11 years ago. Cash purchase. He's not registered with a phone or utility in his name. The property runs off-grid, solar array, well water. He's been out there since he retired from the Corps 6 years ago. She's there, Dorian said. We don't know that. She's there. She needed someone who knew how to disappear and knew how to teach her to do the same. She went to the only person who could offer that. Is there surveillance? Not yet. The property is remote. We'd need to put someone on the ground 2 days in advance to get eyes on it without being seen. And Wren, boss, if she's with a retired Marine reconnaissance sergeant, anyone we put out there needs to understand that he will see them first. Send 2 of our best. Dorian paused. Tell them not to engage. Observe only. A longer pause from Wren. And if she's not there, then we're back at 0. Dorian looked at the harbor. But she's there, Captain. She was not there. Or she had been there and was no longer, which was what the 2 men Dorian sent came back and reported after 5 days on the Montana ground. Property occupied. 2 residents, 1 male matching Garth Monroe's description, 1 female whose physical profile was consistent, but who they had seen only at distance and only twice, because she moved through that land like she was trained to move through it, which meant she knew the property's sightlines and stayed inside them. And then, on the 4th day, the female had not been seen at all. On the 5th day, one of the 2 men found a deer trail camera mounted in a pine tree at the property's northern perimeter, aimed directly at the position he'd been using as a hide. She had known they were there from day 1. Dorian listened to this report with his elbows on his desk and his face in his hands, a posture no one in his organization had seen before, and he breathed through his nose slowly, and he said, "Come home." He sat with the information. She had been there. She She had seen his men before his men saw her. She had waited 4 days, 4 days of deliberate visibility, leaving them enough to report back without enough to confirm, and then she had stepped sideways out of the frame. Garth Monroe had trained her. In what time frame, Dorian did not know. Months, probably, which meant this had been planned even further back than Callaway Freight, even further back than the bet, which meant the architecture of this was deeper than anything he'd mapped, and the specific terror of that. Not fear, but the cold structural recognition of a plan whose first move had happened before he knew the game had started, moved through him like a current. He called Wren. "She's gone from Montana," he said. Wren said nothing. She knew we were watching. She waited us out, and then she moved. Still nothing from Wren. "Say what you're thinking," Dorian said. "I'm thinking," Wren said slowly, "that this woman memorized your vault code from a document on your desk, mapped your laundering infrastructure from inside a freight company, cleared her apartment 3 weeks before the wedding, went dark the same night, had a military-trained exit plan already in place, and just burned 2 of our best surveillance men in the Montana wilderness without ever letting them see her face." He paused. "I'm thinking we have a serious problem, Dorian, and I'm thinking the problem is not finding her. What's the problem then?" "The problem," Wren said, "is that she's already started." Dorian frowned. "Started what?" "Price flagged something this morning. I was waiting to confirm before I called you." Papers shuffling. "The shell company that runs the Dorchester Laundry, Meridian Services, LLC, its primary bank relationship just got a regulatory inquiry, not a full audit, a preliminary inquiry, which normally we'd handle through the contact at the compliance office. Except that contact called Price this morning and said the inquiry didn't come through normal channels. It came through a third-party financial tip submitted anonymously through a federal consumer portal. Dorian did not move. "Someone," Wren said, "who knows exactly how Meridian Services is structured, submitted a tip that is specific enough to trigger a preliminary inquiry, but clean enough that it doesn't look like an insider. It looks like a sophisticated outside observer." Another pause. "It was filed 11 days ago, while we were still looking for her in Albany." The line hummed. "She's not running," Dorian said. "No," Wren said, "she's not." Dorian stood up from his desk. He walked to the window. Below him, the city was moving in its ordinary way, indifferent, continuous, and he looked at it with the feeling of a man who has just understood that the ground he's been standing on has been shifting under him for longer than he knew, and he had only just now felt it move. The Meridian inquiry was the first domino. Dorian knew it the morning Price brought him the full breakdown, a 14-page preliminary document from the Federal Consumer Financial Portal flagged by the compliance office at Harbor National Bank, where Meridian Services LLC had held its primary operating account for 6 years. The inquiry was narrow, surgical. It asked about 3 specific transaction patterns across an 18-month window, and those 3 patterns were exactly the 3 patterns that would be hardest to explain without revealing the 2 layers beneath them. Whoever had filed the tip had not guessed. They had known. They had known the way someone knows who has spent years inside the numbers, reading the architecture from the bottom up, mapping where the clean money ended and the dirty money began. Dorian read the document twice. Then he called the compliance contact at Harbor National, a man named Fells, who had been on Dorian's payroll for 4 years. And Fells answered on the first ring, which meant Fells was scared. "Can you kill it?" Dorian said. "The inquiry is already logged in the federal system," Fells said. "I can slow the internal response, delay the document pull by 3, maybe 4 weeks, but I can't make it disappear from their end." 4 weeks? Maybe, if nothing else comes in. "Nothing else will come in," Dorian said, because he needed to say it, not because he believed it. He hung up. He looked at Wren across the desk. 4 weeks on Meridian. Wren nodded. His face was the controlled face. "I've already started moving the secondary accounts. The Somerville operation can run through the Braintree structure temporarily. It'll cost us roughly 8% in handling friction, but it's cleaner." "Do it." Dorian stood. "I want a full audit of every shell layer we have that touches a company Hazel Monroe could have accessed through Callaway. Every single one." "That's going to be a long list." Then start now. Wren started for the door, then stopped. Danny Reeves called again. Coyle? Coyle had lunch with a man named Petrovich yesterday. Different spelling, different man. Not the Szymanski logistics contact. This one is independent. Eastern European money. Splits his time between Providence and Montreal. Wren's voice stayed level. He's a broker. He connects buyers to distressed assets. The word distressed sat in the room. Someone hired a broker, Dorian said. Someone hired a broker, Wren confirmed, and that broker had lunch with our waterfront captain. Dorian was quiet for a long moment. Who knows our organization well enough to know Coyle is the weak point? Wren said nothing, because the answer was obvious, and saying it out loud was the kind of thing you only did once. Put Coyle in a room, Dorian said. Tonight. What? Coyle was 34, had been with the organization for 9 years, and had the kind of face that made people underestimate his intelligence, which was a face Dorian had once considered an asset. He sat in the back office of the waterfront warehouse with his jacket on and his hands flat on the table, and looked at Dorian with the expression of a man who had prepared for this conversation and was now finding that preparation insufficient. Wren stood by the door. Price was outside. The broker, Dorian said. Petrovich. Coyle said, I don't know who that is. You had lunch with him yesterday at Pier 44. I have lunch at Pier 44 3 times a week. It's close to the dock. Coyle. A beat. Coyle's jaw shifted. He approached me. I didn't reach out to him. What did he want? He said he was representing a buyer interested in the Atlantic route, the Charlestown to Halifax leg. Coyle's eyes went to Wren and back to Dorian. I told him the routes weren't available. I told him he had the wrong conversation. And then I left. Coyle leaned forward. Dorian, I've been with you 9 years. I'm not flipping. I don't care what anyone's offering. Who sent Petrovich to you specifically? He didn't say. He didn't say, or you didn't ask. Coyle's mouth tightened. He didn't say. And I didn't push because I was trying to end the conversation, not extend it. If I'd pushed, he'd have known I was interested. Dorian looked at him for a long moment. Coyle held it without looking away, which was either the behavior of an innocent man or a very good one, and Dorian had spent 20 years learning the difference. You should have called me the same day, Dorian said. I know, I was going to. You were going to. Tonight. I was going to call tonight. Coyle's voice had an edge now. Not aggression, something rawer than that. I didn't want to come to you with half a story and no name. I wanted to find out who sent him first. How were you going to find that out? I was going to take his card, Coyle said. Run the number. Dorian said nothing. Coyle reached into his jacket pocket and produced a business card. Plain white. A Montreal phone number and the name V. Petrovich. No company. He set it on the table and slid it toward Dorian. Dorian didn't pick it up. He looked at it. I'm going to give this to Price, he said. If the number traces clean, you're back on primary manifest Monday. And if it doesn't trace clean, Dorian stood up. Then we have a different conversation. The number traced to a logistics consulting firm registered in Montreal 18 months ago. The registration documents listed 2 directors, one Canadian, one a shell entity registered in the Cayman Islands. The Cayman entity had been incorporated 22 months ago. Price put the timeline on Dorian's desk and didn't say what it meant because Price was smart enough not to have to. 22 months ago. 4 months before Dorian ever sat on a bench outside Callaway Freight with a cup of coffee. The Montreal firm had begun operating, had been capitalized, structured, and registered before Dorian knew Hazel Monroe existed. He sat with that for a long time. The money that had capitalized the Montreal firm, $2 million, moved through 4 intermediary accounts in 3 jurisdictions, clean at every step. The kind of clean that costs more than the movement itself. The kind of clean that requires someone who understands how to make dirty money look like it evaporated and reappeared somewhere else as something new. $2 million from a woman who had $11,000 in savings and a $42,000 salary. Unless the money wasn't hers when the firm was incorporated, unless someone had given it to her or invested it through her. And this was the thought that made the back of Dorian's neck go cold. Unless the money had never been hers to begin with, and was instead the opening capital of a structure built specifically to dismantle his, funded by someone with both the resources and the motive to see him fall. Price, Dorian said. Price was at the laptop. Already looking. The Cayman entity. Who are the beneficial owners? Working on it. Cayman disclosure is slow. Best case, 3 weeks through our contact. Faster. I can pay faster. It'll still be 2 weeks minimum. Dorian stood and walked to the window. The harbor was doing what it always did. Indifferent, continuous, gray. He pressed one hand flat against the cold glass and thought about the sequence, the Callaway account mapping, the vault code, the Montana exit, the Meridian tip, the Montreal firm, the broker sent to Coil. Each move precise, each move timed, each move designed not to destroy his organization outright. That would have been simple and left him nothing to do but retaliate, but to loosen it. To introduce friction at every load-bearing joint until the structure started to torque under its own weight. This was not revenge. Revenge was emotional and therefore inefficient. This was a campaign, and he still didn't have a name for whoever was running it, because Hazel Monroe, the Hazel Monroe from Price's file, from the bench, from 8 months of Tuesday coffees and Ethiopian food and green dresses, did not have $2 million and a Cayman shell company 4 months before he'd introduced himself, which meant there was someone else. He turned from the window. Get me everything on Marcus Holt from the last 3 years, he said. Full financials. Not the surface ones. The real ones. Every company he touches. Every investor. Every partner. Price looked up. You think Holt is behind this? I think Holt put her name in front of me, Dorian said. I think he knew exactly who she was when he did it. And I think he has been watching this happen with a great deal of satisfaction. He moved toward the door. I think the bet was never about $5 million. Wren found the connection on a Thursday afternoon, and he found it not through Price's financial forensics, but through a conversation with a man named Sal Greco, who ran a small insurance brokerage in Brookline and had been, 20 years ago, an accountant for a firm that Marcus Holt had used in his early years to move money through Suffolk County real estate deals. Sal Greco was 61 and tired and had 3 grandchildren and wanted nothing from anyone. He told Wren what he told him not for money, but because he had a specific and long-standing dislike of Marcus Holt that traced back to a receivable Holt had stiffed him on in 2009 and never acknowledged. He told Wren that in the early years Holt had used a woman to manage the books on the real estate side. Not a firm, a single woman, freelance, who was known in certain circles for discretion and an almost inhuman ability to trace money backward through structures designed to resist tracing. She had worked for Holt for 3 years, and then they'd had a falling out. Sal didn't know the details. And she disappeared from the circuit. Her name, Sal said, was Carol Monroe. Wren called Dorian before he was out of Sal Greco's parking lot. Dorian said, Monroe. Carol Monroe saw, Wren said. Hazel Monroe's mother died in a car accident when Hazel was 9. A long pause on the line. Sal says Holt and Carol Monroe had a professional relationship that ended badly. He doesn't know what happened, but he says Holt has mentioned her over the years, in conversation, in the way people mention things that still bother them. Dorian's voice was very quiet. How did Carol Monroe die? Single vehicle, icy road outside Lowell, January, 22 years ago. Wren paused. Hazel was 9. The line hummed. Wren, Dorian said. Yeah. When Holt put her name in front of me at Caruso's, he said she was invisible. He said nobody notices her. He said she eats lunch alone. Right. He wasn't reading from a profile. He was too specific. He knew her habits. He'd been watching her. Another pause. He set this up, Wren said. Not a question. He set me up, Dorian said. He needed someone to approach her. Someone she couldn't approach directly without showing her hand. So he baited me into doing it for him. He put her in my path and waited for me to be exactly who I am. His voice had gone flat and cold. And I was. Wren was quiet for a moment. What did he want her close to you for? Information? Access? The same things I've been trying to figure out she took with her. Dorian stopped. Or he wanted to make her visible. She'd been mapping his operations through Callaway the same way she was mapping mine. He knew she was watching. He put her in front of me to flush her out, to force her hand. And instead, Instead, she saw both of us coming. Dorian's voice was almost quiet enough to be calm. Almost. She let me court her. She let me think I was running the game. She collected everything I had access to, every piece of organizational intelligence I inadvertently gave her over 8 months, and she used Holt's bet as the exit trigger. A breath. She was never running from me. She was finishing the job. The silence on the line had a specific quality, the silence of two men understanding something at the same moment. Her mother, Wren said. Her mother, Dorian said. You think Holt? I think a woman who was one of the best financial forensic operators in Boston's underworld had a falling out with Marcus Holt in the early 90s and then drove off an icy road 3 years later. And I think her daughter has spent the last 2+ years building the infrastructure to prove it. Dorian moved to his desk. The Meridian tip wasn't about me. It was about following the money back far enough to touch Holt. Using your organization as the thread, Wren said. Because Holt's money and my money moved through the same channels in 3 places. I knew that. I always knew that. It's why we had an arrangement. A pause that had rage in it. She knew it too. She knew if she started pulling on my financial structure, it would eventually surface Holt's. And she knew the federal inquiry would do the work she couldn't do directly without revealing herself. Wren said, very carefully, Dorian, she played you both. The words landed in the room and stayed there. Dorian sat down behind his desk. He looked at the harbor. He pressed his fingers flat on the surface of the desk and breathed through his nose once, slowly, the way a man breathes when he is deciding which version of himself he is going to be in the next 60 seconds. His phone buzzed on the desk. Unknown number, Boston area code. He looked at it. Something in his chest shifted. A premonition, or its cold, rational equivalent. He picked up. Silence on the line. Then a voice, low, controlled. A woman's voice, and he recognized it immediately. Not because it sounded the same as he remembered, because it didn't. It was different in a way he couldn't immediately name, stripped of the careful quietness he'd known, carrying something harder underneath. But because the cadence was hers. The precision was hers. You found the Montreal firm, Hazel Monroe said. Dorian said nothing. That's faster than I expected, she said. You used Sal Greco, or someone like him. A beat. You're connecting it to Holt. Are you calling to tell me I'm wrong? No, she said. I'm calling to tell you that the Cayman entity will take you another 2 weeks to trace, and by then the second regulatory inquiry, the one filed this morning against Holt's primary real estate holding company, will have already triggered a joint review. A pause, deliberate. Dorian, you're not my target. He said, you used me. Yes. You spent 8 months. I spent 8 months doing what I had to do, she said. You spent 8 months doing what you chose to do. We're not the same. The line hummed. What do you want? He said. I want you to stay out of my way for 30 days, she said. After that, whatever is left of your organization is yours. I have no interest in it. And if I don't? A pause. When she spoke again, her voice had the flat, factual quality of a woman reading a column of numbers that don't leave room for argument. Then I filed the third inquiry, the one that connects your Somerville operation to the Braintree structure you moved to this week. And we stop having this conversation entirely. Dorian's hand tightened on the phone. She knew about the Braintree move. He had authorized that move 4 days ago, in this office, with Wren and Price. There were 3 people alive who knew about it, and Hazel Monroe, who was somewhere that was not Boston and not Montana, had just named it on a phone call from an unknown number. You have someone inside, he said. She didn't answer that. 30 days, Dorian. Hazel, don't, she said. And she said it the way he had said it to Marcus Holt on the phone. Not a plea, not a warning, just a word that closed a door. 30 days. The line went dead. Dorian set the phone on the desk. Wren was watching him from across the room with the expression of a man who had heard enough of a conversation to understand its shape without knowing its content, and that shape had frightened him. She has someone inside, Dorian said. Wren went very still. She knew about Braintree. Dorian looked at the phone. Which means she's been inside longer than Montana. Longer than the wedding. Possibly longer than I've known her. He raised his eyes to Wren's face. Who else knew about the Braintree move? Wren said, you, me, and Price. The room was very quiet. Dorian, Wren said. His voice had a careful quality, the careful quality of a man approaching something dangerous slowly. I need you to hear me when I say that I did not— I know it wasn't you, Dorian said. Wren stopped. I know it wasn't you, Dorian said again, and his voice was the flattest it had been, the most drained of anything that wasn't the pure cold arithmetic of the situation. Which means it was Price. Which means Price has been feeding her information from inside this office for, I don't know how long, months, maybe from the beginning. He looked at the harbor. She recruited my own intelligence man before I ever sat down on that bench. He stood up. Find Price, he said. Right now. Don't call him. Find him physically and bring him here. He moved to the window, one hand on the glass, looking out at the city that was still moving, still indifferent, still his. For now, for 30 days, for however long it took a woman he had fundamentally underestimated to finish dismantling everything he had spent his life building. Price Duvall was not at the waterfront office. He was not at his apartment in Charlestown, not at the secondary location on Meridian Street that only 4 people in the organization knew about, and not answering the phone Dorian's men called 6 times in 40 minutes. His car was gone from the parking structure beneath the Charlestown building. His personal laptop, the encrypted one he kept in the office safe, was gone too, which meant he had not run. He had walked. Calmly, with time to pack, which meant he had known this moment was coming before Dorian did. Wren reported all of this by phone while Dorian was still standing at the window, and Dorian listened to it with the specific stillness of a man absorbing damage and calculating what it cost him before he let himself feel it. How long? Dorian said. We don't know yet. Best estimate. Wren was quiet for a moment. If she recruited him before Montana, before the wedding, then everything we ran through Price in the last year is compromised. Every surveillance operation, every financial move we asked him to trace, every name we had him background. A pause that had the weight of the full implication in it. He was running our intelligence. He knew everything we knew the moment we knew it. Dorian said nothing. Dorian, every counter move we made against her, she saw coming, because we told Price, and Price told her. The harbor was gray and flat and indifferent. Pull everyone in, Dorian said. Every captain, every crew lead, tonight, the warehouse on Border Street. I want bodies I can see. And if someone doesn't show, then we know. 14 men came to the Border Street warehouse that night. Danny Reeves came first, which was Danny's way. The man was pathologically punctual, a quality Dorian had always found both useful and faintly irritating. Coyle came third, which was notable given their recent conversation, and he sat across the room from Danny and kept his eyes forward and his hands loose on his thighs. The others filed in over 20 minutes, crew leads from Dorchester, South Boston, the North End. Men Dorian had known for years. Men whose faces he could read in poor light. He stood at the front of the room and looked at all of them and said, Price Duvall has been working against this organization. He's gone. Everything he touched in the last 12 months is potentially burned. The room absorbed this with varying degrees of visible shock. Danny Reeves's jaw went tight. 2 of the Dorchester men exchanged a look that was quick and unreadable. Coyle looked at the floor. We're going to spend the next 72 hours doing a full operational review, Dorian said. Every active account, every route, every contact. Anything Price had access to gets treated as compromised until proven otherwise. He looked around the room. If anyone here has had contact with Price outside normal operations in the last 6 months, anything that felt unusual, anything he asked about that wasn't his business, I need to know tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight. Silence. Then Coyle raised his hand. Not high, just enough. Every head in the room turned. Coyle said, He asked me about the Halifax route 3 months ago. Said he was updating the operational map. I answered him. I didn't think anything of it. His voice was flat. I should have logged it. Yes, Dorian said. You should have. Coyle nodded once and put his hand back on his thigh. Anything else? Dorian said. Nothing. Then we start tonight. Looks around. He didn't sleep. He worked through until 4 in the morning with Wren and two of the North End crew leads, cross-referencing every financial structure Price had been involved in against the timeline of Hazel's moves. The picture that emerged was thorough and nauseating. Price had been feeding her operational intelligence since at least 8 months before the wedding, which meant he had been turned before Dorian ever approached her, which meant her knowledge of Dorian's organization had come not just from Callaway Freight's intersecting accounts, but from a source inside the organization itself. She had walked into those 8 months of courtship already holding more than Dorian knew. He thought about every conversation, every dinner, every careful answer she'd given to his questions, the ones that had seemed like the answers of a woman slowly opening up, slowly extending trust. He turned them over now, looking for the shape of what she'd already known beneath what she'd said, and the exercise was both precise and quietly devastating in a way he did not let himself examine for long. At 4:15, he sent Wren home and sat alone in the office. He thought about Marcus Holt. Holt had known about Carol Monroe. Holt had, in some configuration Dorian didn't have all of yet, been connected to her death. Holt had put Hazel's name in front of Dorian and watched Dorian walk into a trap constructed over what was now clearly years of preparation. The $5 million bet had not been about money. It had been about proximity. Holt had needed Hazel Monroe inside Dorian's world, and Dorian had delivered her there himself and called it a win. The specific quality of that, of having been the mechanism of his own undoing, was something Dorian sat with alone in the dark office at 4 in the morning and did not try to manage. At 4:40, his phone buzzed. Wren. Holt just called a meeting, his people. Tomorrow morning, the restaurant on Hanover Street. Our guy on his crew says the agenda is restructuring opportunities. Those are his words. Dorian read it twice. Holt was moving. The regulatory inquiry on his real estate company had apparently not slowed him, or had accelerated him, pushed his timeline forward, made him decide that the window for picking up Dorian's distressed assets was narrowing, and he needed to act before the federal attention got broader. He typed back, "I'll be there." Wren. "That's not what I—" Dorian. "Set it up. Hanover Street. I want to be in that room." The restaurant was called Fratelli's, and it had been on Hanover Street for 30 years, and Marcus Holt had been using its private back room for meetings since before he was significant enough to need private rooms. Dorian knew the layout. He had eaten there 12 times. He arrived 40 minutes early and sat at the bar with an espresso and watched the room fill up through the mirror behind the bottles. Holt's people came in groups of 2, 6 men total, which was more than a standard sit-down and fewer than a show of force, the configuration of a man who wanted witnesses but not a war. Holt himself arrived last, which was his habit, the entrance of a man who needed the room assembled before he walked into it. He saw Dorian at the bar and stopped. The stop lasted less than 2 seconds. Then Holt smiled, the wide one, the one that reached his eyes, and crossed the room with his hand extended. "Dorian," he said, "this is a surprise." Dorian shook the hand. "Is it? I didn't realize you were joining us." "I wasn't invited." Dorian picked up his espresso. "I invited myself." Holt's smile stayed in place. His eyes moved once to the man nearest him, a broad-shouldered crew lead named Garrett, and back to Dorian. "Well, come on back then." The private room had a long table, 8 chairs, a single window facing the alley. Dorian sat at the far end before anyone could position themselves advantageously, which forced Holt to take the near end, which reversed the natural hierarchy of the room, and Holt knew it and showed it by taking a half-second longer than necessary to sit down. The other men arranged themselves and the room settled. "You called a meeting about restructuring opportunities," Dorian said. No preamble. "I'm here to talk about what that means." Holt leaned back. "It means the landscape is shifting. Regulatory pressure, some personnel instability on various operations. It creates opportunity for consolidation. I thought it was worth a conversation." "Personnel instability," Dorian said. It's a term." "Price Duval worked for me for 6 years," Dorian said. "You recruited him." The room went quiet in a specific way, the quiet of men recalibrating what kind of meeting this was. Holt said, "I don't know what you're—" "Marcus." Dorian's voice dropped to the register that ended arguments. "I've been in this city for 12 years. I did not get here by letting men lie to my face in small rooms. He set the espresso cup down. You recruited Price. You put Hazel Monroe's name in front of me. You funded the Montreal firm that's been running logistics interference on my routes. And you have been watching this whole sequence unfold for the better part of 2 years while presenting yourself as a business peer. He paused. What I want to know is whether the Carol Monroe situation was your idea or whether you've just been covering it for someone. The temperature of the room changed. Holt's smile was gone. Underneath it was a face Dorian had never seen before. See, not angry, not afraid, something more calculated than either. The face of a man deciding how much has already been lost and what can still be protected. That's old history, Holt said quietly. It's the foundation of everything that's happening right now, Dorian said. So no, it's not. Holt looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Garrett. The look meant something, and Dorian saw it, and his right hand moved off the table to his side in the same motion, unhurried, because Dorian had not come to Fratelli's alone, and the 2 men he'd positioned in the main dining room were already moving before Garrett got to his feet. What followed was brief and ugly and not particularly loud, which was the way Dorian preferred it. Garrett sat back down. The 2 other men nearest him made the correct decision. The room resettled in the new configuration. Dorian said, "Tell me about Carol Monroe, CEO." It came out in pieces, the way things come out from men who are negotiating how much truth to trade for how much safety. Carol Monroe had worked Holt's accounts for 3 years in the mid-90s, and she had been, as Sal Greco had said, exceptional. She had found things in Holt's financial structure that Holt hadn't known were findable. Exposures, liabilities, 2 transactions from his early years that connected him to a homicide investigation that had gone cold but never fully closed. She hadn't confronted him directly. She had begun, quietly, methodically, making copies. Holt had found out. He said he hadn't intended for anything to happen to her. He said the man he'd hired to retrieve the copies had exercised poor judgment. He said this with the specific diction of a man who has rehearsed the version of events that minimizes his culpability, and Dorian listened to it with his hands flat on the table and his face showing nothing. Carol Monroe's daughter had been 9 years old. She'd been watching you for years, Dorian said, before she ever mapped my operation. Holt said, I didn't know who she was until about 3 years ago. When I found out, I made inquiries, tried to understand how much she knew, what she was building. He paused. She was too careful to approach directly. So you used me. A silence. You needed her inside my world, Dorian said. Close enough to my organization that when she started pulling threads, she'd pull mine first and yours would come up second. Secondary exposure, slower timeline, giving you more room to... He stopped. The full architecture of it was assembling in real time, and it was elegant in a way that made his jaw ache. You wanted her visible. You wanted her moving openly against a target so that when the federal attention came, it came toward me first. And by the time it reached you, you'd have had months to restructure. Holt said nothing, which was its own answer. The bet was theater, Dorian said. You needed a reason to put her name in my mouth. You needed me to approach her that looked like my idea. He leaned forward slightly. Did you know she was already watching my operation through Callaway? I suspected she had a thread into you, Holt said carefully. I didn't know the depth of it, but you knew enough to make the bet directional. You knew if I approached her, I'd bring her into proximity with my structure, and she'd use that access, and the chain of exposure would run through me before it ran through you. Holt looked at the table. What you didn't account for, Dorian said, is that she is better than either of us. The room was silent. Dorian stood up. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Marcus Holt, at the wide smile man who had sat across a poker table from him in the rain and set a $5 million trap and waited for Dorian to walk into it. And what he felt was not rage, or not only rage, but something more structural, the cold and total recognition that he had been outmaneuvered at every level by 2 people, one of whom was now in federal crosshairs, and one of whom was somewhere in the world moving her next piece. The regulatory inquiry on your real estate company is going to expand, Dorian said. Within 2 weeks, maybe less. Whatever you've been doing to slow it down is not going to be enough. He moved to the door. I'd recommend getting ahead of it. Dorian, Holt's voice was flat. We can still work this together. There are still... No, Dorian said. There aren't. He walked out through the main dining room without looking back, past the two men he'd positioned at the bar, out through the front door of Fratelli's and into the cold Hanover Street air and the ordinary noise of the North End at mid-morning. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed. His phone buzzed. Wren. He answered. The second inquiry, Wren said. The one on Holt's real estate company. Price got a call this morning from the federal portal. Our contact at Harbor National flagged it. It's been upgraded. It's not preliminary anymore. To what? Full audit, Joint Financial Crimes Task Force. They've requested document preservation from 3 banks. Wren paused. And they've subpoenaed the Cayman entity's records through a mutual legal assistance treaty. Somebody accelerated the timeline. She did, Dorian said. The Braintree structure is in the document preservation request, Wren said. Dorian, we have maybe 72 hours before this becomes something we can't manage quietly. Dorian looked at the street. A woman was pushing a stroller past the restaurant. 2 old men were arguing in Italian outside a cafe. The North End was doing what it always did, living its layered and oblivious life around the invisible infrastructure of the people who actually ran it. She wants a meeting, Dorian said. What? She called me. 30 days, she said. But the timeline just moved, which means she's ready. He put his hand in his pocket. She's been ready. She was waiting for me to understand the full picture before she sat down across from me. You think she'll contact you? I think she already has. He pulled out the phone, switched to the message thread with the unknown number from 2 days ago. There was a new message sent 40 minutes ago, while he was sitting across from Marcus Holt in Fratelli's back room. The message was an address, a building on Atlantic Avenue, a floor number, a time, tomorrow, 10 a.m., and one line beneath it, come alone. I'll know if you don't. Wren was still on the line. Dorian, what's happening? She wants the meeting, Dorian said. Tomorrow. A long pause. You're going? Yes. Wren stopped himself. That's either the smartest move or the last one. I know. Dorian looked at the address again. Atlantic Avenue. 3 blocks from the bench where he had first sat down next to a woman eating a sandwich with a paperback book and a posture that said she was braced for something to go wrong. Set up a perimeter. 2 blocks out. Nobody moves unless I signal. And if you don't signal. The morning traffic moved past him. Somewhere above the roofline, a gull was riding the cold air off the harbor, circling without effort, waiting for something to surface. Then you'll know the meeting didn't go well, Dorian said, and hung up, and stood on the sidewalk outside Fratelli's in the November cold with the address of a woman who had spent 3 years building the machinery to dismantle everything he owned. And he felt, underneath the calculation, underneath the operational assessment of tomorrow's variables, something that had no useful name in the vocabulary of a man like Dorian Viscari, something that sat in his chest adjacent to the thing he'd felt walking away from that bench the first Tuesday, the thing he hadn't examined then and could not afford to examine now, the thing that was going to make tomorrow's meeting either a negotiation or a reckoning, and he genuinely did not know which one it was going to be. He arrived at the Atlantic Avenue address at 9:53. It was a building he knew, commercial, 12 stories, the kind of glass and steel construction that had gone up in the late 90s when the waterfront was being repositioned as legitimate. He had passed it 100 times. It had never registered as significant, which he now understood was the point. The lobby security guard checked his name against a list without being asked, waved him through. The elevator opened on the 9th floor to a reception area with no company signage, no branding, nothing on the walls, just clean lines and 2 men standing at the far end of a hallway who looked at Dorian the way men look at something they've been briefed on. Not hostile. Assessing. One of them said, "Mr. Vescari, this way." He followed them down the hall. His hands were loose at his sides. His breathing was measured. He had slept 3 hours and shaved carefully and worn a jacket he'd owned for 6 years because new clothes before a meeting like this would have been a tell, a signal of wanting to be taken seriously, and Dorian Vescari did not signal want. The conference room at the end of the hall had floor-to-ceiling windows facing the harbor, the same harbor he looked at from his penthouse, the same gray water, the same indifferent movement, seen now from a different angle, which felt deliberate in a way he filed without reacting to. There were 4 people already in the room. 2. He didn't know. A woman in her 50s with a lawyer's posture and a man about the same age with the compact stillness of someone with a military background, which meant Garth Monroe, which meant Hazel had brought her uncle into the room. The third was a man he recognized after a moment as a federal financial crimes attorney named Briggs, whose name had come up twice in Dorian's operational briefings over the years as someone connected to major asset seizure cases. The fourth was Hazel. She was standing out of the window with her back to the door when he walked in, and she turned when she heard him, and he stopped. He had spent 3 years constructing a mental image of what she had become, assembled from the Montana surveillance reports, from the precision of her financial moves, from the cold control of her voice on the phone. He had imagined someone armored, someone who had built themselves into a weapon and dressed accordingly, all sharp edges and deliberate severity. She was not that. She was wearing a dark suit, well cut, nothing ostentatious. Her hair was shorter than he remembered. She had lost weight, gained muscle, held herself differently. Not the contracted posture of the bench, the old instinct to take up less space, but something settled, a stillness that came from the inside out rather than being imposed from outside in. There were lines at the corners of her eyes that hadn't been there before. She looked like someone who had done hard work for a long time and had not particularly enjoyed it, but had not stopped. She looked at him the way she had looked at him across the penthouse on their wedding night, that specific, horrible clarity, and said, "Sit down, Dorian." He sat. The lawyer and the federal attorney arranged papers. Garth Monroe remained standing near the window, close enough to Hazel that the positioning was protective without being theatrical. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had been weathered past expression. He looked at Dorian once, briefly, and the look carried a complete assessment and a complete verdict and no particular interest in discussion. Hazel sat across from Dorian and folded her hands on the table. "I'm going to explain what happens next," she said. "Then you're going to have a choice. I'd like to get through the explanation before you respond." "Go ahead," Dorian said. She nodded once. The Joint Financial Crimes Task Force has sufficient documentation to pursue criminal charges against Marcus Holt on 3 counts: wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy connected to the death of Carol Monroe in January of 2001. The evidence was assembled over the past 32 months and submitted to the task force in stages to ensure evidentiary integrity. She said this the way she had always talked about numbers, directly, without decoration. "Holt will be arrested within the next 72 hours. "I know," Dorian said. "Your organization intersects with Holt's in 3 documented financial channels. The task force is aware of those intersections." She paused. "What happens to your organization depends on what you do in the next 30 minutes. He said, "What are my options?" She reached to the folder in front of her and opened it and turned it to face him. It was a document, 40, maybe 50 pages, dense, with the specific formatting of a legal agreement. Option 1. You voluntarily cooperate with the asset restructuring outlined in this agreement. The Vescari organization's holdings, the legitimate ones, and there are more of them than you probably realize your operation has generated, are transferred to a blind management trust administered by independent trustees. The criminal infrastructure is dismantled on a structured timeline over 18 months. In exchange, the Financial Crimes Task Force limits its investigation to Holt and does not pursue the Vescari organization's historical transactions. She met his eyes. You walk away with a substantial sum in a legitimately structured personal account. Not everything, but enough. Dorian looked at the document without touching it. Option 2. Option 2 is that you leave this room without signing, and I submit the documentation that connects Braintree to the Somerville operation and the 3 Holt intersecting channels to the task force this afternoon. The investigation expands. Your organization is not protected. The timeline is not structured. She said it without satisfaction. Just fact. You would likely face charges. You might beat some of them, but your organization would not survive the process intact. The room was quiet. Dorian looked at the harbor. "How much?" he said. "The personal account?" "Yes. $11,400,000, derived from the legitimate holdings only, auditable and clean." She paused. "It's real money, Dorian. earned in the technical sense through businesses that had been operating legally even when the cash that funded them wasn't. He thought about the organization, 12 years of it, the specific weight of having built something from the ground up, not from inheritance, though the North End had given him infrastructure, but from the daily accumulation of decisions, judgments, relationships, the management of violence and money and loyalty in ratios that required constant calibration. He thought about Ren Alcott, who had been with him 11 years and had said, "I told you on the morning after the wedding," with the voice of a man who was still there despite being right. He thought about Danny Reeves and his hat and his punctuality and his waterfront that would be someone else's waterfront now. He thought about what it had cost Hazel Monroe to build the mechanism that was sitting across from him in this conference room with her hands folded and her face giving him nothing he hadn't earned. "The trust," he said. "The blind management trust. Who are the trustees?" "Independent fiduciaries registered in Massachusetts. No connection to my entities or yours. And the businesses, the legitimate ones. They continue operating. Under the trust." "Yes." "The employees. Retained. The trust's mandate includes operational continuity." He looked at her. "You thought about the employees?" Something crossed her face, brief, controlled. "I thought about a lot of things," she said. He picked up the document. He turned through the first 10 pages slowly, not reading every word but reading the architecture, the structure of what she had built here, the legal scaffolding that would replace the one he was surrendering. It was thorough. It was more thorough than anything his own lawyers had produced in years, and his lawyers were good. "This took longer than 3 years," he said. "The legal framework took 14 months, she said. The rest took longer. The Callaway work." "Yes." "You were watching my operation before I approached you." "Yes." "You knew who I was when I sat down on that bench." A pause. "Yes." He set the document down. He looked at her directly. Which parts were real? The room was very still. The lawyer and the attorney had gone careful in their stillness, the way people go careful when they sense they're in proximity to something that isn't their business. Garth Monroe's eyes moved to Hazel and stayed there. She held Dorian's gaze for a moment, then she said, "That's not a question that belongs in this meeting." "I know," he said. "I'm asking it anyway." Something in her jaw moved, a micro-adjustment, the kind he had learned to read over 8 months of Tuesdays. She looked at the window. At the harbor they were both looking at from the wrong angle. "The books," she said finally. "The ones you picked yourself, not the ones you researched." She didn't look at him. Nobody had ever done that before. He said nothing. "And the Wednesday," she said. "The proposal. You didn't—" She stopped, started again. "You knew I wouldn't believe a grand gesture. You knew I needed it to feel like a Wednesday." She said it quietly, without softness, the way someone states a fact they've made their peace with. "That was real knowledge. You actually knew me." "Yes," he said. "I did." "That's the worst part." She turned back to him then, and her eyes were dry and clear and held everything they'd always held, the watchfulness, the reserve, the bone-deep carefulness of a woman who had learned early that wanting things was a liability, that it was real knowledge put to a dishonest purpose. She stopped again. "That's not something you recover from. You understand that." "I understand that," he said. She looked at the document. "Sign it, Dorian." He picked up the pen from the table. He looked at the signature line. He thought about 12 years and the weight of what he was setting down. He signed. The signing took another hour. Exhibits, initials, notarization. The federal attorney, Briggs, moved through it with professional efficiency and said almost nothing except to indicate pages. The lawyer on Hazel's side asked 2 clarifying questions about the Braintree account sequencing and accepted his answers without comment. Garth Monroe stood by the window the entire time and said nothing at all. When it was done, Hazel gathered the documents and passed the originals to Briggs and kept 1 copy, which she put in a folder without marking it. Dorian set the pen down. "Holt," he said. She looked at him. "What happens to him, specifically?" "He'll be prosecuted," she said. "For Carol Monroe. For everything. But yes, that's in it." She said it evenly. But there was something beneath the evenness. Not grief. Grief had been spent. used up in whatever those 3 years in Montana had cost her. Something that had survived past grief into a quieter place. Not peace. The thing that comes before peace, when the work is finally finished. "I'm sorry," Dorian said. She looked at him for a moment. For which part? He didn't hedge it. For the bet. For what it was. For what I knew it would cost you, and did it anyway because I didn't... He stopped. Because you were a variable to me. At the beginning. And by the time you weren't anymore, the damage was already done. She was quiet. Outside, a harbor boat crossed the gray water in the middle distance, slow and unremarkable. "I know," she said. "That's not forgiveness. But I know." He nodded. He stood up. He straightened his jacket. He looked around the conference room. The clean lines, the harbor light, the room full of people who had each played their specific part in a sequence that had started in a rain-wet card room on Hanover Street 3 years ago and ended here, with 40 pages of signatures and a harbor view, and 2 people who had learned each other with unusual precision for unusually bad reasons. Garth Monroe met his eyes as he moved toward the door. The older man said nothing. The look said enough. "I saw you coming before she did. I let her decide. I will not let her be hurt again." Dorian gave him a single nod of acknowledgement and moved past. At the conference room door, he stopped. He said, without turning around, "The restaurant, Columbus Avenue, the first one." Silence behind him. "Third time we went," he said. "You told me you'd wanted to be an architect. You said you didn't trust yourself to learn a new kind of thinking when you were already stretched thin." He paused. "You lied." A long quiet. "Yes," Hazel said. "I lied about that." He walked out. Marcus Holt was arrested on a Thursday morning outside his home in Newton, with the particular unspectacular efficiency of federal agents who have prepared their case thoroughly and do not need drama to make it hold. 2 agents, a vehicle, a document. Holt did not resist. He did not make a scene. He got into the vehicle with the expression of a man who had been calculating odds for 30 years and had finally run the numbers on a hand he couldn't win. Dorian watched the news report on his laptop in the kitchen of the Com Ave penthouse. The last morning he would spend there, the sale having already been initiated as part of the asset transfer, and finished his coffee and closed the laptop. Wren came by at noon. He sat at the kitchen island where they had sat the morning after the wedding, and they drank coffee in the way they drank it, without ceremony, without a great deal of fuss. And Dorian told him the full shape of the agreement, and Wren listened to all of it without interrupting. When it was done, Wren was quiet for a while. Then he said, 11 million. Yes. Clean. Yes. Wren turned his cup in his hands. And the organization. Transfers to the trust. Operations continue. The criminal side winds down over 18 months. The cruise. Retained. The waterfront operations run legitimate under the trust. Danny Reeves will probably do fine. He's always been better at logistics than anything else. Wren said, Coyle. Coyle can stay or go. His call. A silence. The kitchen was bright with the midday light off the harbor. In 2 weeks it would be someone else's midday light. 11 years, Wren said. I know. You're not going to ask me what I think. No, Dorian said. I know what you think. Wren drank his coffee. I think you made the right call, he said. I want that on record somewhere. Noted. I also think you should have made it about 18 months ago, Wren said. Before the bench. Before the whole, he gestured, a wide motion that encompassed the kitchen and the penthouse and the last 3 years and the weight of everything they contained. Before all of that. Probably, Dorian said. She was better than both of us. She was better than all of us, Dorian said, including the people who trained her. Wren almost smiled, set his cup down. What are you going to do? It was a real question, which meant Wren was asking about after, about the geography of a life that had for 12 years been structured entirely around the organization, the decisions, the daily management of something large and complex and morally indefensible that had nonetheless given his days a specific gravity that would now be absent. I don't know yet, Dorian said. That's the first time I've heard you say that about yourself. It's been a week for firsts. Wren stood. He put on his jacket. At the kitchen door he stopped, which wasn't something Wren did. Wren was a man who left rooms cleanly, without the hesitation of unsaid things. He said, "For what it's worth, the 8 months. Whatever else it was, you were different. I noticed." Dorian looked at him. "Doesn't fix anything," Wren said. "But I noticed." He left. Yeah. Dorian spent the last night in the penthouse at the window. Not pacing, not drinking. Just standing at the glass with the city below him and the harbor beyond it, watching the lights move and the water move and the slow, ordinary progress of a Thursday night in Boston going about its business. He thought about the sequence in its entirety, from Caruso's to the bench, to the wedding, to this window, to the conference room on Atlantic Avenue. And he let it be what it was without trying to reframe it. That was new. The not reframing. He had spent his life managing the interpretation of events, bending them toward the version that served the next move. There was no next move here that required management. The shape of what had happened was the shape it was. He had wagered a woman's dignity for $5 million, and she had used that wager to dismantle everything he'd built, expose the man responsible for her mother's death, and walk away with her own name clean. He had known her with unusual precision and used that knowledge badly, and she had known him with the same precision and used it better. He had told her the true things, his mother, the North End, the things that had come out before he decided to say them. And those had been real, and she had known they were real, and she had filed them alongside everything else, and he did not blame her for that. It was what you did with true things when the context around them was false. You kept them. You put them somewhere safe. You did not let them change the calculation. The detective always gets there in the end. He had thought, when she said it on the bench that first Tuesday, that she was talking about the book. He had thought she was talking about comfort. He had been right about both and wrong about everything else. He went to bed at midnight and slept for 6 hours straight, which was more than he had slept in a single stretch in 3 years, and he did not dream. And in the morning, he packed 2 bags and left the penthouse for the last time without standing at the window again because he had already said what he needed to say to the view. 6 months later, in a city that was not Boston, Dorian Vescari was sitting at a table outside a coffee place on a narrow street that smelled of salt water and baked bread, reading a newspaper he didn't entirely understand because his French was still functional but imprecise, when his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He looked at it for a moment. He answered. Silence. Then, "You're in Marseille." He was quiet for a beat. "You're still watching." "Old habit," Hazel said. "I'll stop." "You don't have to." He set the newspaper down. Around him the street was doing its morning things. A man hosing down the pavement outside a market, 2 women with a stroller arguing pleasantly about something. The particular Mediterranean light that was nothing like Boston, and which he had chosen specifically for that reason. "How is it?" "Done," she said. "The last trust transfer completed last week. Holt pleaded to the federal charges. He'll be in a minimum security facility in Connecticut for 9 years, probably 6 with behavior." A pause. "The case on Carol Monroe's death was ruled a wrongful death in civil court last month. The judgment was against Holt's estate." "I saw that," he said. "There was no one to receive the damages," she said. "I put them in a fund for children who lose parents to organized crime in Massachusetts." She said it the way she said most things, directly, without performance. It seemed like the right place. He said, "It is." A silence. Not the silence of discomfort, the particular silence of 2 people who have said the necessary things and are sitting on the far side of them. "Dorian," she said. "Yeah. The architect's question. You asked me on the bench why I gave it up. I said I didn't trust myself to learn a new kind of thinking." "I remember." "I've been learning a new kind of thinking for 3 years," she said. "It turns out I was wrong about what I could do." He looked at the light on the water at the end of the street. The harbor here had a different color than Boston, warmer, something green in the gray. And he thought about a woman on a bench with a paperback book held open with her thumb pressed flat against the page margin, braced for something to go wrong, watching a detective work her way toward an answer that was always going to be there if she followed the evidence far enough. "I know," he said. "I knew that before you did." Another silence. "I'm not calling to—" She stopped, started again. "I'm not offering anything. I want to be clear about that. I know. I just wanted you to know it was done. All of it. Thank you, he said. He meant it in more ways than he said, and she heard the more ways in the way she heard most things, completely, without missing anything. And she said nothing in response to them because there was nothing to say, and they both understood that, and understanding it was its own kind of conclusion. Take care of yourself, she said. You too, he said. Hazel. Yeah. The fund, he said. For the children. What's it called? A pause. The Carol Monroe Foundation, she said. It seemed right to put her name somewhere it would do something. He said, It's the right name. I thought so, she said, and the line went quiet. He sat for a moment with the phone in his hand and the morning light moving on the street and the smell of salt and bread and the sound of the city he was learning the shape of, slowly, without a map, the way you learn things when you no longer have the luxury of sending someone ahead to brief you. He put the phone down. He picked up the newspaper. His French was imprecise and functional and getting better. And the story he'd been reading before the call was about a waterfront redevelopment project on the Marseille port. Logistics infrastructure, new shipping channels, legitimate capital investment in a city that had been managing the intersection of legal and illegal money for centuries, and had lately decided to make the legal kind work harder. He read it to the end. He thought about it. He folded the paper and set it on the table and sat with the morning for a while. And the man hosing the pavement finished and coiled his hose and went back inside. And the women with the stroller turned a corner and were gone. And the light moved the way it moved here, differently than anywhere he'd been, warm and unhurried and specific to this particular piece of coast. After a while, he took out his phone and opened the contacts and found the number for the independent financial advisor Wren had recommended before Dorian left Boston. A legitimate one, fee only, the kind who didn't ask where money had come from, because the kind Wren had found already knew and had already vetted the clean $11 million and confirmed its cleanliness. He called. The advisor answered. Dorian said he wanted to talk about infrastructure investment, specifically port logistics, specifically legitimate frameworks for capital participation in redevelopment projects in southern France. The advisor said that was an interesting area, said there was a lot of movement there, said he'd done some preliminary research on it, and would Dorian like to come in and look at some numbers? Dorian said yes. He sat in the morning light for another hour after that, drinking coffee that was better than anything he'd had in Boston, watching the street learn itself around him, and he thought about nothing in particular. He thought about the weight of what he had put down and the specific unfamiliar lightness of standing somewhere new, with no structure he was responsible for and no violence. He was managing and no careful system of loyalty and calculation that required his constant attention to hold its shape. He thought about a woman who had grown up without a mother and spent 20 years carrying that weight quietly and then 3 years more spending every piece of herself to do something about it, and had finished and had called him from wherever she was to say so, and had wished him well, which was more than he deserved and exactly what she was. He left a tip on the table that was larger than necessary, because the man who had brought the coffee had done it without being asked for anything. He hadn't ordered and had refilled the water glass twice without being flagged down. And Dorian had spent enough years making men stay attentive through fear to understand now the difference between that and the version where people simply did good work and ought to be paid for it. He walked back through the narrow streets toward the apartment he was renting month to month, not ready yet to commit to anything, still learning the place, still learning what he wanted a place to feel like. And the salt air came off the water in the way it did here, warmer than Boston, carrying something southern and unhurried. And Dorian Viscari walked through it with his hands in his pockets and his face in the sun and the long-carried weight of 12 years of building something wrong, finally, completely, and irrevocably set down. Behind him, in a city he had left, a fund in a dead woman's name was doing its first work. In a minimum security facility in Connecticut, a man with a wide smile was learning what accountability felt like from the inside. In the offices of a blind management trust, ordinary people were running ordinary businesses that had been built on extraordinary wrongness and were slowly becoming something that didn't require wrongness to sustain them. And somewhere, in a city Dorian didn't know, in an office without his name on the door, with a view he hadn't seen, a woman who had once eaten lunch alone on a bench outside a parking garage, holding a manila folder to her chest with both arms the way people hold things when they're not sure they belong somewhere, was sitting at a table that was entirely hers, in a life that was entirely hers. And she was not braced for anything. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she was not braced for anything at all.